All right, this is our first look at what we're going to do this year, and this is one of our first looks at how we're going to do it. Now remember that this basically is or covers 1 through 13. Getting used to this this new software I'm using. So we're just introducing government to you. Now, government is laid out in such a way that 3 of the 4 parts that we're looking at are, in a sense, elective in nature, though 2 are only directly related to what people decide. The others aren't. And actually, this is really only, when we look at these 4 here, executive, legislative, judicial, and bureaucratic, only 1 of those is related to or has a relationship to the people deciding. And that, of course, is the legislative branch. And there's some reasons for that. The Constitution lays it out in a number of ways. The legislative branch originally had the House of Representatives elected directly by the people. The Senate was elected by the state legislatures. The executive branch was elected by the Electoral College. We elected the electors, so it's a quasi electoral role that we play. Not until 1913 was the Constitution changed in order to make all the states elect their senators in the same way, and that meant now that senators with their 6-year terms were elected the same way that House members with their 2-year terms are elected. The judiciary is not elected by the people. The judiciary is nominated by the executive branch and it is then determined by the legislative branch if the nominees made by the executive branch are going to be confirmed or not. And so the compromise that the founders made when it came to the judicial branch was that their method of placement would be determined by the executive and the legislative branch. But unlike those 2 branches, any judge, any federal judge sitting on the bench, either as a Supreme Court justice, an appeals court justice, or a district court judge, never has to face election. They have a life term, and they can only be removed through either bad behavior, in which they're impeached, or they retire, or they die. And usually they outlive the people that nominated them in the first place. Now, bureaucracies have been around since the time of recorded history. We have a number of ledgers and things from civilizations like Sumer, and certainly the Egyptians left us lots and lots of papyrus to show that their society very much was run by bureaucrats. And you couldn't build a Great Pyramid without having a bureaucratic state. And in the United States of today, we also have a bureaucracy. It's our 4th branch of government. The problem with the 4th branch of government is that it's unelected. And in many cases, like with the IRS, it is the judge, jury, and the executioner. It determines the policy, it determines whether you're guilty or innocent, and then it assesses a fine or even jail time when it finds that you have wronged their regulations. But all 4 of these, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, the bureaucratic branch, all of them make policy. Now, the definition of politics itself is the process by which we elect our government. Now, theoretically, if you'll notice that last part of the statement, we're supposed to produce authoritative decisions, but we're living in a time of gridlock, and voters seem to prefer gridlock, thinking that, well, at least they can't do anything to us because one branch is run by one party, one branch is run by the other party, and they can never agree. We already see this in the polling for the 2014 midterms, that people want the Republicans to have both, as bad as they think about the Republicans, but they want to have the Republicans to have control of both the Senate and the House. because the Democrats are in control of the executive branch. Now we also know that this is a game, and unfortunately, it's a very serious game. In many ways, our lives are affected by the game of politics itself. It's not a game in a traditional sense. It's a deadly game. People play for keeps, and we can see here in this cartoon, the politician saying, "I'd like your vote." The citizen says, "Well, what do you have to offer?" And he says, "The power to take his money and give it to you." And the man says, "Well, hey, I can agree with that." Government and the game of politics is really, really powerful. And let's also look at Laswell's definition, which your book talks about. He puts it in very simple terms. Who gets what, when, and how? And that's very simple, it's very basic, and it's also very, very true. Now we look at the policymaking system. This is in your book, on page 8 or 9. We can look at the process. If we have the people here as this big nebulous yellow ball, we can see that people consider interest, problems, concerns, they bubble up and they bubble down according to what happens at the time. People, for instance, in 2012 were very, very interested in the effects of Hurricane Sandy before the election. 3 months later, they could care less about it because they've moved on, and now other problems are in their sights. When a problem becomes really big, the linkage institutions, in which there are 4. When I learned this, there were 3, but now we include a 4th one. The traditional linkage institutions, and this is an AP term that you have to know, are the parties. And when we say parties, these are the political parties. And media, cable and over-the-air free media, radio, newspapers, now the internet, and then interest groups. Anybody from the NRA to the Sierra Club. These are all interest groups. Once these interest groups have seized hold of the issue, it gets on the policy agenda. If enough people consider the issue to be strong enough, then these linkage institutions can seize that issue, and it becomes a political issue. So Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, Iraq right now is on the political issue. The immigration problem down at the border, all of these are political issues. And it is then up to the policymaking institutions, the 4 we already looked at, the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the bureaucracies, to come to some kind of resolution in providing a remedy for that political issue. That policy then can be any number of ways. It could be spending money on the problem. The president on the border issue wants to spend $3 billion more. It could be in order to address a shortfall in revenue, a rise in taxes. It could be the passage of a new law. It could be new regulations. Or they can decide not to take issue with it at all, thinking that time and perhaps people moving on to another issue will actually resolve whatever it is that they're concerned with right now. Then, at the very end, before it gets back to the people, there are winners and losers in the process. Some people are impacted negatively by the decisions the policymaking institutions make. Some people are impacted in a positive way from the remedies that are provided by those institutions. So this is how, when you look at the screen here, this is how these issues are dealt with by our policymaking system here in the United States. Doesn't mean that this exists everywhere else, and it kind of doesn't. Countries that emulate our system, or we emulate parts of their system, Britain, Australia, Canada, Japan, so in some ways, all of these kind of mimic this system. Now, the people, of course, have interests, they have problems, and they have concerns. And so that's what, when your book talks about the people, it's what we have to remember about this is that many times the focus of the people is fleeting, and it may be strong for 2 weeks and then it goes away because uh, the uh, the game now has another objective, or something else has happened, and so people's interests have now shifted elsewhere. So we know that these three things are they're very dynamic. They continue to change all the time. Um, Now again, you have to know these four. First, of course, are the political parties. That's the Democrats and the Republicans. Those are the two main parties. There are other parties out there, but these are the two main ones. People might occasionally show a temporary interest in other parties, Libertarian Party, Socialist Party, but third parties have really never gained long-term traction. They have for maybe an election or two, and then they go away. And there's a reason for that. Usually, the two main political parties co-opt um, the issues that these third parties have brought up. The elections basically occur every 2 years. We are now um, looking at the 2014 midterm elections. The next election after that would be the 2016 presidential elections. There's always a midterm election when the president isn't running, and essentially sometimes that midterm election could be a referendum on how the people feel that the president is doing. And then 2016, 2020, 2024 are all presidential election years. The news and entertainment media, this has been really fractured. For the first almost 200 years of the Republic, it was all about newspapers and magazines. And then you had to include radio in that, starting in the 1920s. And then, starting in the 1950s, television. But those three things have now fractured, because what's happened is people are reading less, at least in the traditional media. They're reading less. They're reading a lot on the web, but it's different. What has happened is three things actually. Talk radio, which I grew up with, but it didn't have anywhere near the dynamic that it has now. And talk radio leans to the right. Then there is cable news, which is dominated, for better or for worse, and this causes kind of, for many people, a very visceral reaction. Cable, which used to be dominated by CNN, is now dominated by Fox News, who usually draw 50% of the audience or more. Other cable news organizations would be MSNBC and CNN, Al Jazeera, the business networks, so on and so forth. And then there is the new kid on the block, the internet, which, for better or for worse, more and more people are getting their information from that. The problem is many of these people aren't smart enough to know what is right and what is wrong. And many times they just repeat what they hear without any basis of knowledge as to why they're repeating it or why it's important. Now the other ones are interest groups. They've always been around since the beginning of, like political parties, they've always been around since the beginning of the Republic. But it's been since the 1960s and 70s, when there was changes in law, that interest groups really began to climb up. And nowadays we have large-scale interest groups, we have PACs, we have any number of things. So the process is very dynamic. And whether you like it or not is, maybe what's something that you'll discover in our time together over the next 8 months. Now, as we begin to look at the last couple things here, the policy agenda again is the issue that the government will pursue at a certain point in time. Right now, we're pursuing Iraq. Right now, we're pursuing the immigration issue. The items at the top are supposed to be taken care of first, and then as they resolve an issue, it moves down the list. The thing is, it's a very dynamic process, and sometimes a very non-dynamic process. As you can see here, it takes a lot of years for something to get on the policy agenda. It also then, from that point onwards, will take more time, an extended length of time, for it to get acted on. So things will bubble up, move down, bubble up, move down, and that's just the nature of the policy agenda itself. Now there's also the policymaking institutions. Again, the legislative branch, the executive branch, the courts, and we do include the state courts in this, and the two bureaucracies in our federal system at the federal level and at the state level. And you'll find out what federalism is in very much a little while. And finally, as we wrap up this first lecture, we have to ask ourselves again at the end of that graphic that we saw, who's the winner? Who's the loser when an issue is resolved? Who gets the resources? Who has resources taken away? Those are the questions that we have to ask ourselves as policies are implemented. So this ends lecture 1. Again, it's pretty broad, is it not? There's going to be a number of lectures for Unit 1, which basically covers chapters 1 through 3 and a little bit of 4. And then we'll be loading one of these up probably almost every night. Again, I told you, you're going to have to be working hard. You're going to be working consistently. You can't slack off. This is a college level class. You fortunately get more time to adjust. In colleges, they usually start later and they end earlier, so you have a very concentrated effort that you have to give. You have to do it here too, because I realize you have 5 other classes, but please take note of these and make sure that you listen to them, take notes, and be ready to answer questions the next morning. And this is going to start this week. I'm just uploading it, giving you a little bit of time to get ready and adjust. So this is the end of Lecture 1, pages 1 through 13.